Welcome to Growing Joy.
Thank you, Maria. Lovely to meet you.
I love that we both have green walls or lots of houseplants behind us.
Yes, yes, it's one of my kind of Achilles heels of just having a lot of plants around. Yeah. I don't
Yeah,
manage to keep them all alive all the time, and they still die, but I do love having them.
me neither. I've been doing this for 7 years. I'm a houseplant expert, and still, they're tropical plants that were not meant to live indoors in air conditioning. So,
Yes.
with that, there's always going to be some attrition. I'm so excited to chat with you about biophilic design because I feel like, and I'm curious how you feel over in England, but I'm still shocked at how few people really understand what biophilic design is. And it's the simplest, easiest way, I think, to improve your life. How did you come about discovering it and kind of devoting your life to it?
Well, do you want the long story or the short story? The long. Let's go for the longer.
Either.
The
Let's
longer,
go
the,
for
the
the
bigger,
long.
the
Yeah.
bigger picture. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to grow up in England, by the coast, in a town called Brighton. I think it's one of the best cities in England, if you ask me. So Brighton is like a wonderful, sort of very vibrant, very charismatic city that was actually built where it is or developed because of its proximity to the sea. So the Prince Regent came down from
Mm.
London, and he sort of instilled in people this love of bathing in salt water and how it was so good for your health. And so Brighton grew up here. I was born here. My mum was born here. So I grew up here and spent my childhood sort of playing in the sea. The countryside's not very far away, so we'd sort of grew up either swimming in the sea, surfing, windsurfing, climbing through forests, making camps, badly making tree houses and stuff like that.
Mm.
So my childhood was really quite immersed in nature, but I had a love of architecture. We have this thing in England called the British Pleasure Pier, which essentially is like a promenading platform that allows the sort of genteel folk of Regency England to promenade out across the sea. And it was like
Mhm.
a sort of static boat that people could walk from the coast out over the waves, and there'd be slatted timbers and you could look down and see the waves. It was very sort of multi-sensory. So we've got two of these piers in England, and I was always sort of inspired by this very sort of frivolous form of architecture that
Mm.
very deeply connected you in a very sensory way to the natural world. So it was this kind of combination of frivolous architecture but with a deep resonance to nature, and that was just sort of the most magical thing, and then formed some of my earliest experiences of architecture. And then I knew that I wanted to study architecture, so I went and studied in University College London, called the Bartlett School of Architecture. And yeah, I guess slowly my sort of passion for architecture and my historical personal background and a love of nature slowly merged as I recognized that it shouldn't just be the built environment and nature, that these two things are not sort of disconnected, that it really should be one of the same. And
Mhm.
so my work suddenly was like, when I found out about biophilic design, I was like, it was a light bulb moment. It's like, this is what I should be doing. This kind of
Mm.
makes all the pieces add up in my life. It makes sense now. Yeah.
Totally. That's beautiful. Did you learn about biophilic design in architecture school, or was it something that you discovered after?
No, not at all. I mean, when you're studying architecture, you're sort of taught to worship at the altar of the kind of the hero architect. The Mies
Yeah.
van der Rohe, the Le Corbusiers, the Philip Johnsons of the world, and the modernist architects. Look at them, look at the work that they're doing. But actually, once I discovered biophilic design, I found out about the sort of psychology behind it. It's an evidence-based approach, so it is backed up by 20, 30 years of evidence-based empirical research by
Hmm.
environmental psychologists that says, when you add light to natural light in buildings, it can support your well-being, support your circadian rhythm, it can improve the speed of learning, it has all these benefits. And so it made a lot more sense than just hero worshipping an architect who essentially has great publicity and marketing. But finding out this evidence was really important. And in my early sort of studies in architecture, we did do a little bit of the sort of psychology of architecture, but it was never a really prominent part.
Mm.
When I found out about biophilic design and found out about all the evidence that underpinned it, that made it so compelling, it was like, yes, finally we have some evidence that demonstrates that when you add nature to architecture, you get better results and less negative issues.
You're really worshiping at the altar of Mother Nature, is what you're doing. It's like Mother Nature's the original architect. If you think
Yeah.
about fractals and you think about, just in the incredible geometry that we see in nature that
Yeah,
a
the
lot of architects
biomorphic shapes and patterns and forms that
totally.
form so many of the great buildings that we love. Think about the cathedral arches that we find in Gothic cathedrals. They're simply sort of mimicking the arbor and the branches that we find in sort of colonnades of trees.
Yeah.
There's so much of it there.
And so now you have a full architecture design firm devoted to biophilic design. Share kind of what you do now.
Yeah, so we are, I mean, I studied architecture, but I guess now we're more sort of biophilic design consultants. So we work on very large projects, working alongside really big design teams, which will have other architects, interior designers, it'll have sort of mechanical and electrical experts, lighting experts, structural engineers, all sorts of different people coming together. So a lot of our work really looks at how we can enhance spaces with nature. So it's essentially how we make spaces better by bringing elements of nature in. So we
Hmm.
investigate the stresses and strains that people find in particularly commercial spaces. We look at the quality of those spaces and how elements of nature can be brought in to mitigate the negative aspects, the stress, the strain, the fatigue, the burnout, and help to improve on the intended function. So no
Yeah.
two projects are ever really the same, and we really sort of look at applying quite a wide variety of different what we call patterns or biophilic features into buildings to alleviate the stresses and create a more positive outcome.
Yeah, this is why I'm so excited to talk to you today because the majority of your work is commercial, large scale, people that have the money to back this research, the buy in on this research to really apply it. And it's interesting when I was doing research for my book, where I have a whole section on biophilic design in it, all of the studies center around workplace. They
Mm.
center around, city health. Like they center around where there's money to be recouped. There isn't as many studies of just having, the impact of biophilic design like on someone's home. But what I have found is these principles are pretty applicable. Some of them, that you're doing at scale, we're not going to be doing in our homes. But I do feel like biophilic design should be known by all interior designers who you hire to do your home and help with a renovation, as much as, in the States, we have the Amazon spheres, which are
Hmm.
basically this enormous terrarium that I've been lucky enough to visit. You see most of the large scale, particularly tech companies with a lot of money, are implementing biophilic design in all of their offices because that's where all the studies are.
Yeah.
So yeah,
90% of typical business operating costs are in staff and people. So
yeah.
and there is this enormous war for talent. So obviously, where you're spending all that money in buildings, only a tiny amount, relatively tiny amount goes on, the ownership of the building, the renting of it, and the resources like gas and
Hmm.
electricity and water. But a massive cost is just having people in the buildings and attracting talent. And when you've
And
got that
having them be
talent,
happy.
you want them to be happy. You really want them to be productive. You want
Yeah.
them to stay, to be creative. You don't want them to be ill. You don't want them to leave because there's a better organization that looks after its people better. So I think, this business case is really important. And I think you could look at it more like in the UK, we have Formula One racing where a lot of innovation takes place. You have NASCAR, don't you, in America?
Hmm.
So a lot of innovation in automobile technology happens in these kind of elevated spheres. And I think you could look at it like that, that a lot of, where there's a really strong business case for wanting to create the best building to support people, particularly spaces where people experience a lot of stress and physical and mental fatigue and
Hmm.
potentially a lot of burnout. That's where you're really going to have a lot of benefit, particularly if you're paying people enormous salaries. You want them to be there, you want them to hire the best, and you want to attract people. You want to create places where people immediately walk in and feel like they're not just going to survive another day, they're actually going to thrive and they're going to flourish by being in this building. They're going to become better versions of themselves. So I think that business case is really
Oh, it's so
important in
important.
commercial spaces.
100%. I'm not arguing against it. It's the way the
Yeah.
world changes
Hmm.
is that trickle down effect. But I'm just so excited to chat with you about the larger scale and how we can
Yeah.
apply it.
it is happening in other aspects of residential architecture. So in the UK, we've been working with a house builder called John Lewis, who have been looking at how elements of nature can help to create better, more appealing places, improve what we call the curb appeal, but also encourage people to stay. They've been creating what's called build to rent. So this house builder builds houses in order to rent them out to people. So they're sort of managed residential properties.
Hmm.
So the idea is that you attract somebody to come and live in this high-rise building, lots of flats. You create lots of public amenity like gardens out the front or roof terraces,
Hmm.
places where people can come and gather and mix and mingle and make connections with their neighbors. They can feel more relaxed. They can walk in and go, finally, I'm home, and get that sort of overwhelming sense of nature
Yeah.
and make sure that the health and well-being is being supported. And so they've created this really strong business case for bringing nature in, not just to attract people to want to go and live there, but also to help them connect better to the people around them, their neighbors. And also, once they connect with their neighbors, they know they're going to stay for longer. They don't want to leave if their friends are all around them and they can mix and mingle with them easily. It is starting to trickle into housing. What we're not necessarily seeing it is in the sort of volume house builders in the UK have yet to really sort of look at the sort of the value of what we call natural capital.
Yeah. In time. In time.
Yeah,
So can you give us a definition of bio? I mean, obviously we've talked about it a little bit, but I would love to hear your definition of biophilic design,
right.
and also with these larger studies, like what are the impacts? What are the results of these large scale buildings that you're creating?
I'll answer the first question to
Yeah.
begin with. Okay, so what is biophilic design? Well, biophilia quite literally means a love of nature, and it explains humans' innate attraction to nature and natural processes. It's important to remember there is an evolutionary design ethos. It recognizes that for hundreds of thousands of years, as we evolved, we did so in the midst of nature. We used our senses to
Yep.
evaluate a landscape, to recognize the features that might help us more than survive, but actually thrive and flourish. So we looked for greenery because it was an indicator that water was present. It was an indicator that soil was present. If there was
Hmm.
abundant and diverse sort of leaf plants and trees, then that would likely increase the possibility of the existence of a wide biodiversity within
Hmm.
it. When we saw greenery, it sort of led us to kind of connect that that was a healthy landscape that could support life, and we could equally survive, thrive, and flourish there. So is this evolutionary design ethos. We fast forward several thousand years, and whilst we haven't necessarily developed and our senses haven't necessarily changed that much, our surroundings very much have. And we now find ourselves not in leafy, green, flourishing savanna environments, but dense, noisy, urban spaces that were filled with rectilinear angles and hard shapes and surfaces, very reflective, poor air quality. Nature is sort of brushed to one side, it's shoved outside of buildings and not inside. And so we live in a very hostile, sterile, and importantly, always on environment. There's always noise, there's always light, there's always something that's sort of jangling our nervous system and keeping us overstimulated. So, biophilic design is really the means by which we bring elements of nature in to help us to reduce stress, to help us recuperate from intense periods of physical and mental activity, to help us getting back to being at our best.
Hmm.
So it's particularly important when we think of the spaces where we experience lots of stress. So that might be at work, might be in the places where we study, it might be in hospitals and healthcare environments. Maybe it's in spaces where we're trying to unwind, like hospitality spaces. And of course, it's really important to remember that the one constant from all these different spaces is our home. So that's why it's so important, whether there is a strong business case for bringing it in or not. From a personal perspective, it's not just a nice to have, and it's an essential component of how we create a happier, healthier, more connected place to live. Now, what's so exciting about biophilic design, as I mentioned before, is that it's an evidence-based approach. So there are, hundreds of
Hmm.
studies by these enormously clever environmental psychologists who have been studying large groups of people, reacting it to environments and seeing how they are benefited by elements of nature. Those elements of nature might be sunlight, it might be the sound of nature, it might be the haptic quality, the feel of the space. It could be about color, texture, pattern, shape, or form. There are so many different ways that we can improve qualities of space. Now, these studies have happened across all different building typologies. So when they have looked at the home, some of the studies have shown that actually when trees are present in neighborhoods, there's a 5 to 8% increase in property prices. Property prices also increased when houses were closer to green spaces than further away. And actually a 10% increase in tree canopy can see a 15% decrease in violent crime and a 14%
Hmm.
decrease in property crime. That's kind of, really, very compelling. In education spaces, just optimizing the amount of natural light that floods into classrooms has been shown to increase the speed of learning by 20 to 26%. Test scores go up by between 5 and 14%. Students who study in classrooms with real timber walls have heart rates of, on average, 1,600 beats per day less than in a conventional classroom.
Crazy.
It's amazing. Healthcare spaces, healthcare spaces should be designed to help people get better faster.
Yeah.
But of course,
Hmm.
so rarely, that's quite a
But
rare
it's all just like
occurrence.
white and angular. Like
Yeah.
when you walk into a hospital, it's all just white and, 90-degree angles.
Yes, exactly. But there was a seminal study by a psychologist called Roger Ulrich. And what he did is he
Yeah.
looked at the recuperation rates of patients coming out of gallbladder surgery. And what he found from looking through the records was that patients were recuperating in two different types of room. One room overlooked a brick wall, and another room overlooked a view onto trees. And he found that the patients that were recuperating with the views onto trees recuperated 8.5% faster. Nearly 10% faster. And separate studies have shown that actually patients that recuperate in natural light feel less pain and as a result need 22% less pain care medication.
And in the Ulrich study too, they recovered faster and they also were kinder to their nurses. There was
Yeah.
another element of it that like they like treated their nurses and their caretakers. There was some other
Empathy, a
element
greater
of
level
that.
of empathy. I can imagine. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that people are feeling less stressed and more comfortable. And so, what you're saying, we become better human beings when there are elements of nature that can engage us.
Yeah. It just makes so much sense too. It's like when ADHD is soaring right now, when depression in children is soaring
Hmm.
right now. Like all of these issues, all of the results of social media and screens and all of this. You think about how our ancestors evolved, and they evolved with leather shoes that connected them to the earth, and they evolved in buildings that were made of natural materials,
Hmm.
and they were in nature. Like this separation of nature and the human body is
Mm.
so new if you look at the real timeline of the world, of society, of civilization. And it makes so much sense when you think about it. And yet, I feel like in order to completely like reverse where we've gotten, there need to be these studies. And the studies are fascinating, but I'm also like, yeah, that all makes so much sense. Like it
Mm.
makes so much sense
Yeah.
that we're nature, we're living things, we should be surrounded by nature, whether we're spending 8 hours a day in our office or whether we're spending the remaining of our day in our home. Like it
Yeah.
just,
But when I,
yeah,
when I tell people this, firstly, wow, that's an amazing statistic. And then they're like, I kind of knew that.
yeah,
People know it, but they
yeah.
need the kind of
They need
framework
the
of biophilic
reinforcement.
design. They need the compelling statistics for them to go, oh yeah, maybe that's right. And, it's really interesting. We've bought into this sort of notion of design being an elite thing that,
Yeah,
it's an added extra, it's the designer model. But actually, the things that we're talking about are not just nice to have, they're fundamental to how we should be creating better places that better support us and connect us
yeah.
to not just one another, but all living things and the
Hmm.
wider sort of planetary ecosphere.
Totally. I'll never forget when I lived in New York City for 12 years as an adult. And in the pandemic, I moved to 5 acres in the middle of the woods in upstate New York. And I'll never forget how when I moved to upstate New York, I was so scared to go by my windows at night for like the first 3 months because it was complete darkness outside. And like I didn't realize how desensitized to street lamps I was and to noise. Like this concept of the silence is deafening. Like it was deafening, like to just be in the absence of aural pollution and light pollution. But it's like you don't understand how desensitized you've been until someone hits you with a statistic or you transplant yourself and you kind of like snap out of the fog that we've all been in.
Mm.
What are the key elements of biophilic design that you're thinking about when you're approaching a project?
Yeah. There are three key aspects to biophilic design. The first is what we call the direct connection to nature. So this is how we bring real sensory forms of nature in. It's things like natural light, fresh air, the movement that we see in nature, the changes that we see over time. It might be about the presence of water or greenery. So there's real natural things when you think about being out in a forest. That's the direct connection. And those are the most powerful multi-sensory kind of stimulants that we can get. But often in so many of the urban spaces we live in, we just don't have the opportunity to gaze out of a window onto a beautiful forest or a piece of greenery. So we need to find alternative ways. And this is what we call indirect connections to nature. So this is how we use natural materials, natural colors, patterns, textures, and even technologies to mimic and evoke a feeling of nature in a space. And the third is what we call the human spatial response. And this is about remembering that we did evolve in close connection to nature. And many of those spaces that were important to us as cave people, as we evolved, are still important to us today. That idea that we need to understand our landscapes, this idea of prospect, of refuge, of being able to sort of tuck ourselves away. But also that spaces don't necessarily need to protect us and to kind of restore us. We also need spaces that are exciting and stimulating and enriching and to create that sense of awe and wonder, that idea that being out in nature just give you a sort of reverence of the kind of wider ecosystem, that reminder that you're just a tiny part of something much, much bigger, but you are a part of it. And you should just be looking out and going like, wow, look at this place. And we've lost that, a lot. But, like you say, when you go out into nature and you look at that incredible mountain or see the stars at night or a shooting star or a full moon or, a sort of blood moon or, see incredible waves or, the light glinting off water, you get that sense of awe and wonder that is just sort of so wonderful.
Awe is the missing ingredient. I feel like to all adults, because you're programmed not to experience it anymore when you're an adult. But awe really is that secondary element, result of being in nature that you get to reconnect with.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Now, fundamental to all of this is our senses. I think for a lot of people and a lot of companies and the commercialization of the idea of biophilic design, it's, I'm going to buy that plant, I'm going to buy that color, I'm going to buy that texture, I'm going to buy that pod, and I'm going to do biophilic design. And of course it's going to get commercialized, but fundamental to all of this is our senses and how we look after our senses and thinking about how we stimulate and energize ourselves, how we use our senses to help us to focus, to collaborate with other people, but also use our senses to relax, restore and recuperate ourselves. So whilst I've mentioned these three sort of cornerstones of biophilic design, essentially more and more of our work is about our sensory comfort thresholds and how we seek out the places that support our senses in an appropriate way to deliver on the intended function of that space. And that function may be just to have a really good night's sleep. It could be to sit around a table and have a good conversation. It may be that that space is there to energize and excite and stimulate you, to give you that sense of awe and wonder, that sense of presence and purpose and connection to something bigger. But our senses are so key to it. And so going back to something you just touched on before about neuro-inclusivity, that idea of ADHD and all the different sort of aspects on the kind of neurodiversity kind of scale, it's so important to look at all the things that are going on around us and how we're starting to recognize that people are hypersensitive to sensory stimuli. They're also hyposensitive. They like to seek out sensory stimuli. And in between all of that is everybody. So we shouldn't discount these people who are living at the fringes of our sensory kind of world. We need to look at what's happening in their lives, recognize that diversity exists, and design for these sort of very sensory beings. And if we design for the extremes, then actually we capture everybody. So whilst bringing nature into space, most people go, I'm going to bring a few plants in, natural
Right.
materials. It's
Check.
really, yeah,
It's so
okay.
much more
Well, we're
than that.
both there, of course, I know we are. But it's
Yeah.
really about keying into our senses and trying to understand, what is it that excites you and stimulates you? What are the sorts of spaces that help you relax, restore, and recuperate?
Love this. Thank you for calling that out. I think you're so right in everything you just said. Also, it's not just about putting a plant inside. I mean, please bring plants indoors and please have plants
Yeah.
inside. Like, that is a fabulous way to begin this journey, but there is so much more. So, I'd love to ask you, you mentioned fresh air and you mentioned like how do you approach airflow when it comes to this? And replicating, because I feel like with a lot of offices and buildings it's that like stagnant air and the scent, we get disconnected from our sense of scent when we come
Mm.
inside. How do you approach that from a biophilic perspective?
Yeah. I mean, it's worth sort of looking at the sort of bigger, sort of healthy buildings, a kind of ecosphere. So there are lots of ways that we can create healthy buildings, and there is a building standard called the Building Standard. I don't know if you know about
Hmm.
it. It is based in the States, initiated by the International Well Building Institute, IWBI. And there is a number of other different standards, the Living Building Institute as well. And what they try to do is to create a series of sort of standards and measurements and the sort of numbers by which we can start to create healthy buildings. So it will start to help you understand the number of air changes per hour, the sort of things that might bring toxins in, the impact of scenting, the negative aspects of things off gassing. So um, many of these things are quite subtle for people, particularly, if you walk into your own home, you don't necessarily smell it. But if you walk into somebody else's home, it always has a very distinct smell.
Hmm.
So we do
Hmm.
become quite habituated to certain scents quite quickly. So some of our sensory inputs are very powerful. Our sense of smell is really strong and it can take you right back to a moment that happened decades ago really quickly, but equally we do get habituated quite quickly. So I think there are some sensory inputs and biophilic aspects and wellness features that are kind of really important. Some of them are more about getting air changes per hour, so stale air out and fresh air in. In my own home, I've got what's called a whole home heat recovery system. So in
Mm.
any room where you've got a water, like the kitchen or the bathroom or where the washing machine is, you have air being drawn out. So so stale, humid air is drawn out, and that stale air, the warmth is extracted, and that warm air is then sort of pumped back into the house. So you get fresh air coming in and stale air being taken out, and it goes through a filter in between. So there's some quite technical things, and I think a lot of the world of healthy buildings is quite checkbox. It's quite sort of technical, and you can solve
Mm.
lots of problems like lighting, fresh air, water quality through that. But I think one of the nice things about biophilic design is that it's a very sort of visual sense about what a healthy building looks like. It's very
Hmm.
tactile, it's very sensory, whereas I think a lot of the other wellness features are just sort of built into the fabric of buildings.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so if I was hiring you to consult with me on my little house, which I know that you don't really do, but maybe.
We do some housing. Yeah. I've
Yeah,
got my own
somehow.
house.
Right. I know. I've seen on your website you have like
Yeah.
one or two homes. But when I'm looking at a renovation or when I'm looking at my house trying to make it more biophilic, what are the first things? Like what's the lowest hanging fruit that I could approach? It's probably not looking at my HVAC system or my air conditioning system, right? Like what is the lowest? Where are the real opportunities for making change?
I would imagine it's looking at the local environment and seeing what opportunities exist. So the most
Mhm.
obvious one when you look at the opportunities is natural light. Look at the natural light that comes in, how it sort of moves, how the light sort of moves around your home across the day, the way light comes into your house, maybe reflects off surfaces. So natural light is like, that is like the supercharging of any space. We all gravitate
Mm.
towards spaces filled with light, and light creates so many opportunities for enhancement of well-being in space. So whether it's natural light coming in and supporting and regulating your body's circadian rhythms, which help you to sleep better at night and wake up feeling more energized and ready for the day ahead, or whether having that natural light allows you to look out and extend your view, or look out onto a garden, or to bring and support plants in your home. Improving natural light is probably the most powerful way to improve the biophilic quality of the
Mm.
space, because it leads to all sorts of other opportunities, whether it's sort of opportunities in your home for improving the quality of the space, for growing plants, or even looking out onto elements of nature outside your home and making sure that you position furniture so that you sit and look out onto a garden or make the most of natural
Mm.
light at the right times of day.
Yeah, what about say you're living in an apartment that, I lived in an apartment once where I only had windows on the southern side of my house of my apartment. Do you have recommendations for like types of light bulbs, or are we shooting for a grow bulb that's going to mimic the photosynthetic spectrum of the sun? Do you get granular like that when you're designing?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of the spaces that we design are, quite deep plan commercial buildings. And to be honest, once you move away like 2 meters from a window, actually the amount of natural light, or what we call the lux levels of light, dramatically
Greatly dry. Yeah.
decreases. So you really need plants that can sort of live in very, very low light levels. If and actually a lot of plants don't really want to be right next to the window in full sunlight. Lots of the plants that we have here come from tropical conditions where they grow in the forest floor, so just get sort of dappled light through the day rather than the kind of the full blast of natural light for 12 hours a day. Your question is really more about artificial light, isn't it? So managing natural light, particularly south-facing, is important. You can get sort of Venetian blinds, which are, obviously slats that you can maneuver to allow you to control the amount of natural light that comes into a home, and so allows you to control those light levels. But when we start to think about artificial light, I think particularly in the home, you should be thinking about the kind of the color temperature of light. So you want to be
Hmm.
thinking about having warmer lights in spaces where you're going to be relaxing and getting ready for bed, and more stimulating light in places where you're doing tasks like kitchens or workplaces, if you've got a home office. So the warm lights are more red and orange and yellow, and the more stimulating lights are kind of maybe more yellow or more blue. And
Hmm.
they reflect, they're more like the sort of light that you get in the middle of the day where you're supposed to be up and awake. If you were a cave person, that's the time of day where you'd be able to spot a potential predator or see potential prey. You want to be energized and stimulated. But think about the kind of natural light that you might experience if you were to go camping and try to replicate that.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of talk about the use of circadian lighting in workplaces, but actually because we tend to go to workplaces, maybe 9 in the morning, maybe till 5 or 6, it doesn't really affect us quite so much. I think it's really in the home where we should be thinking about, bedside lights or lights in your lounge or the spaces where you're going to occupy just before you go to bed for a couple of hours, making sure that you get a warmer quality of light before you go to sleep. You put your phone down, have a sort of ready orangey light going on, read a book, and that's how you kind of sleep better. Thinking about your circadian system and the color temperatures of light that you might experience outside.
Do you have Kelvin recommendations for like where you like to live for those warmer lights?
Oh, we don't really use Kelvin.
I was just going to also say, do you have Kelvin? Do you measure it totally different over there?
We do. Yeah. We use kind of color temperature. Yeah. So it's slightly different. Yeah, but I think the numbers are a little bit confusing for people. So I think it's
Yeah.
just easier to
Warm. Look for warm light
yeah.
or cool light.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just yeah. Warm light or cool light, cool light where you're working and you need lots of clarity and you need to be stimulated and not falling asleep, and warmer light where you're, or ready light, when you're going to sleep.
Yeah, it's interesting as I've been doing my renovations, all the light fixtures we've purchased have multiple different functions with a touch of a button. You can go
Great.
warm, neutral, cool, and then now you can buy all these different light bulbs that
Yeah.
turn red at night, just like you said, and they're just like normal bulbs that you can just put in your
Yeah.
bedside lamp.
And
So
how
it
do
is.
you find it? Does it make a difference to you in the way that you feel and relax and sleep?
So I'm moving next week into my house.
Oh,
So the lights went in yesterday. So I will report back. I'm going to do a solo
okay.
episode after this episode where I will definitely report
Yeah.
in. But the studies show it, and
Yeah.
I believe it. My husband is big. He wears the red,
Oh, wow.
the
Yeah.
blue light blocking glasses at night. Like we're very into all of that. So we definitely believe in it enough to
Yeah.
invest in it for
Yeah,
our
yeah.
home.
I mean, obviously you're doing a whole home renovation, but there
Mhm.
are lots of really easy things that people can do. So beside my bedside I've got it's called a Lumi light clock, and
Okay.
it's a brand that maybe we have in England. I don't know if they're global yet, but basically it's got like a sort of half moon on
Yeah,
top.
like a sunrise type lamp.
Yes, and that so basically it wakes me up with light in the morning. So half an hour before my alarm is set, it comes on very, very deep
Oh,
red.
nice.
And over the course of half an hour, it goes from a deep red to a kind of warm orange to an orange to a yellow. And just about the time my alarm is supposed to go off, it's a really bright bluey light.
Mm-hmm.
When you get used to it, I never get to the point where the alarm actually goes off. And the alarm's lovely
Mm-hmm.
because it's actually the sound of sheep bleating and the sound of a
I
river
was going to ask,
going
is it bird
through
song? I hope
and
it's bird
birds and
song.
it's
Yeah.
like a forest sort of it's like a sort of English countryside sound.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really lovely sound, but I never hear it because I always wake up very naturally because I've become much more sensitized to that kind of light coming.
Wow, that's fascinating. What about color? What
Yeah.
about color? Interiors got real white, all white kitchens, all white everything,
Mm,
minimalism. How can you subtly evoke the senses with natural color palettes? And
yeah.
how would you suggest going about selecting that?
Yeah, color's really interesting and quite tricky as well because I think there are a lot of personal preferences in color.
Hmm.
We're influenced by our own personal histories, by the local ecology, by our culture, maybe by our religious beliefs, maybe by the places that we've gone to on holiday. So
Hmm.
we propose quite a sort of an open idea. It's called the ecological valence theory. And what it suggests is that we react well to colors that we previously had positive experiences of. So the idea is that we use colors that we've seen in nature, that we've experienced, and we use them in ways to elicit a similar positive effect. So the suggestion very, very loosely goes
Hmm.
that blues remind us of cool, calm pools of water. So they're very calming, very relaxing, very restorative. Whereas greens remind us of the fresh shoots of spring. They're more energized, more stimulating. They help us to focus and to concentrate. Yellows are very warming, very welcoming. They remind us of the warmth, the summer sunshine, picnics outside, and maybe ripe crops. So they're very warming, very welcoming spaces. They're very social colors. And colors like orange and red are very stimulating colors. They remind us of the warmth of ripe fruits and berries. Often we might be sort of expelling sort of certain energy. Maybe they remind us of the flickering flames in a fire. There's lots of energy with those colors, so we need to use them quite carefully. So the idea is that you use colors to elicit these positive experiences that you've had, and you find ways of bringing them into your environment, whether that's your home or the place you work or your school, to elicit that physiological and psychological response to space. So it does ask you to look at your local environment and look at the materials, the colors, the textures, the way you experience. Do you want to sort of pick out particular flower that has an incredible scent? Can you use that in a similar proportion and a similar plane or aspect that you've seen it in nature? So I think it's quite an open color system that for me aligns with our experiences in nature and those positive experiences and looks at how we can bring them back into our built environment.
When you're looking at a large scale building that's going to house, be a business with hundreds of businesses in it, and you're not going off of one person's relative experience with nature in a particular way, what is the palette that you tend to pull out of?
The color palette.
Hmm.
Well, I think most of the buildings that we have, we can never be absolutely, the ones that we work on, we can never be absolutely certain of the people that are in the building currently will still be the people in the building in 10 years' time.
Hmm.
So we sort of do try to look at, what is it that captures the kind of the widest cross section of people? How can we use colors to create places that are calming, relaxing, and restorative? How do we sort of start to zone those spaces from a sensory perspective? So, yes, you have those calming, relaxing spaces. You have those places that elicit a sense of quiet focus or creative collaboration, but also those spaces that are welcoming and sociable, those spaces that are stimulating and energizing. And we want to create kind of a palette of different spaces to support people's physical, mental, and emotional needs throughout the day. And those needs change, depending on if you're tired, you're stressed, you're hungry, you're overworked, your needs change throughout the day. So you do want to offer this sort of diversity of spatial zoning that offers the most opportunity for people to feel comfortable in the environment that they're spending time in.
And you're an architect by trade, so even if you're a consultant, you're probably also thinking about the larger scale materials. So what are the natural materials that you like to be putting in, and what are interesting swaps that you've seen as biophilic design has become more and more popular?
Yeah, the palette materials that we sort of tend to suggest sort of again sort of relate to those that we find in nature, and look at how we can help people feel more connected to the outside. Maybe thinking sort of vertically through the building of how you sort of connect to local stones and local kind of materials, whether there are kind of rivers in the areas, but sort of working up through reflecting the kind of colors of trees, of bark, maybe the colors of leaves, the shapes as well. So I guess the materials that we use do tend to try and reflect some of that sort of local ecological connection to place. But it varies. We do want to excite and stimulate people, give them a moment of wonder, create some sense of excitement for them, some sense of exploration, some sense of novelty, some sense of, sensory enjoyment of the space, of sort of creating sort of a haptic invitation, that idea that you might want to reach out and go like, that feels so nice, like putting sort of cork on a wall, particularly if it's sort of still got a sort of nice, sort of rugged vernacular texture to it, or even something like a terracotta that might feel cool to the touch. So we often think about the sort of sensory mapping, the zoning, the sensory quality of those spaces, and the materials that we're putting in.
Yeah, what are some examples of what you just said, like some cool installs you've done that you feel really proud of for inspiring that awe and that, ooh, I want to lean in for a minute?
Yeah. Well, they really vary. One of the most sort of heartwarming projects we did was a relaxation room for children in an autistic school in London called the Garden School. It was it was really the smallest project we've ever done. It was a single room. It looked out onto a playground, but that playground for these autistic children was just a space where they got totally overwhelmed with the noise and the kind of movement and the sensory overstimulation. So we created a space that allowed the children to look out onto the playground but not be totally connected to it. So we put window seats next to the windows so they got the natural light and they got that sense of prospect onto the playground, but from the safety of sitting on a window seat behind a glass window. Beyond that, we created some little hexagonal niches and we carpeted them. This was with a company called Interface, American company based in Atlanta. And we carpeted these little hexagonal niches, and what we found was that children just loved to climb into them. And the carpet actually changed the kind of acoustic setting, and so just made the space feel kind of safer, and they could lean into the space, get that sense of refuge. But also in the space, and it wasn't very big, we created a little area that had haptic invitations, little interactive features where the children could touch these sort of little hexagonal push plates, and on those push plates were pebbles, were leaves, were kind of artificial grass, were different textures of wood. And they could touch them, and as they touched them, they pressed down a little bit, and an acoustic soundscape sort of came out across the space, and a light came down. So either the children were getting that
Whoa.
sense of prospect onto the playground, feeling safe in the refuge of these hexagonal niches, or getting a little bit of sensory stimuli and the cause and effect of this kind of little feature. So that was a really lovely one where we weren't using all of the biophilic features. We just picked a few to go, what do we want to do? How do we want the children to feel relaxed, recuperated, and maybe even a little bit more stimulated through this room? And it was just so wonderful to see it. So, if people look on our website and search our education spaces, they'll see the Hackney Garden School. There's a really lovely little film that shows the children in the space, and it's just,
It's so cute.
yeah,
I was
it's really
going to ask
lovely.
about that. I looked at it and I was like, I want one of those hexagons, like
Yeah,
an adult sized. I want one in my
yeah,
office. And it almost felt like it's moss, like the velvet is like a little,
yeah,
like moss burrow in a tree or
yeah, yeah.
something. That's so cool. How have you, I'm sure you have incorporated water in interesting ways in buildings. And do you have any suggestions for ways that people could play around with bringing water in beyond like your
Yeah.
faucets in your sink?
Well, that's the obvious one, isn't it? That you make more of your bathroom and then you turn it into a spa space. And the good thing
Mm.
about that is, don't think of it as being, just a purely functional space, but think of it as probably being the most multi-sensory room in the house. Make sure there's a lock on the door. Make sure, just because you want to have some privacy and some kind of
Mm-hmm.
relaxation time, think about the way that you might experience nature in a shower, in a bath, at the faucet, maybe even the humidity and the sorts of plants that like being in there. Water is a slightly difficult one because it is incredibly powerful. It's very multisensory, but bringing it into buildings and spaces that don't
I
manage it
know.
well is risky because of something called Legionella, which is a kind of bacteria that can form particularly in stagnant water when it warms up. And when that becomes airborne, you get something called Legionnaire's disease, which is really very damaging for it's causes sort of respiratory, very, very severe respiratory issues. So you have to be really careful. So there are products out there that allow you to bring the shape and the form of water in, but you do have to be really careful, particularly in commercial spaces. That said, I think some of the most interesting ways that we're finding of bringing the sense of water into spaces is artificially through technology. And there are some
Oh, tell
really
me more.
well, there are some really interesting companies that use sort of natural soundscapes to
Mm,
mask distracting background noise. So we're
mm,
not trying to overwhelm people, but what we are trying to do is reduce people's perception of distracting voices, of technology beeping, of kind of phones ringing, of people having, loud conversations. And by creating these acoustic soundscapes, particularly of water and birdsong,
mm-hmm.
is a really powerful way to create a gentle hubbub that creates a much calmer, more relaxing space. The only problem is that if people hear the sound of rushing or trickling water, but they can't see it, then it becomes a negative because they think, is there a pipe that's broken? Is
Oh.
something gone wrong? Is the building being flooded? So
Mm-hmm.
you've got to do this multimodal form of water representation that you need to see it somewhere. So if you walk into a building and you see a fountain and then you hear that fountain as you walk into a reception, you've seen it, you've clocked it. Oh, of course I can hear the fountain because I'm just, a few meters away. You won't necessarily think about the acoustic effect of the glass wall in between. It makes sense. You've seen it and you can hear it. So that makes sense. Or, you can even have a television screen, a high resolution television screen showing a babbling brook or a gentle waterfall or something very, gentle form of water. And then
Mm-hmm.
you connect the sound of that water from what you're seeing to what you're hearing. And then you can extend that acoustic sound effect further than beyond the visual realm of that screen.
That's so cool. So it's not coming from the sound isn't coming from the screen.
Yeah.
It's that you're marrying the two.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I wrote my whole book to a YouTube video of a babbling brook like nature sounds. And it's the best. Like it makes such a difference when
Mm,
you're in an office or when you're working
yeah.
to listen to that. But I knew what it was because I was playing it. Any other suggestions that you might have for people who learn about biophilic design and say, yeah, I do want to play around with this in my
Yeah.
home?
Well, actually, we've sort of discussed this idea that a lot of biophilic design ends up being in commercial spaces. What happened was we recognized this and we thought, God, there's so much learning that we've done in commercial spaces. Why isn't it being talked about more in people's homes? In my office, we have people that own homes. We have people who are moving to their first homes. We have people who are just left home or people that are renting. So all sorts of people having homes. They're in different stages of their lives. And we wanted to sort of bring a lot of the learning that we've done and found from commercial spaces and make it accessible. And of course, a lot of this is quite technical and a lot of it's, to be honest, quite boring. Nobody really is that interested in sort of lux or lighting levels or kind of indoor air quality. So we wrote a book called Design a Healthy Home,
Yes.
which is it's a really good introduction to people, helping them to understand what the things are that they should be thinking about in people's homes. What are the triggers for creating a healthier place? What are all the things that they should be thinking of? It doesn't go into lots of depth in each, but it does go, it talks about the idea of circadian rhythms. It talks about different color temperatures of light. It talks about natural light, how you can bring it into your home or do it artificially. And it's all the key touch points in there that allow you then to go away and research it more. So there's sort of 100 ways to create a healthy home. And it covers all sorts of things from color to texture, different activities, connectedness with other people, natural light, sleep, sound, water, indoor air quality, planting. So yeah, that's probably the best way for people to get the most inspiration because,
Yeah, the best next
yeah,
step. And then
exactly.
you also have a school, right? Do you have it's an
It's
online
an online
course, it's an
school. Yeah, yeah.
in-person school?
Yes, so we decided to focus on biophilic design in the home. Again, what we wanted to do was to get people understanding the features and the patterns of biophilic design and help them see it as an ethos, not as a sort of guiding aesthetic principle, but sort of try and introduce people to the idea of what biophilic design is, what it comes from, and how you might apply it to your home, but allow people to develop their own stylistic approach to it because
Hmm.
people have all different ways of approaching color, texture, pattern, rich and visual richness in the home. So we've given them the framework. So the design school essentially is kind of a way to think about biophilic design, but allow you to develop your own personal look and style within it. So whilst we've got the sort of framework, we encourage people to use Pinterest to gather images, to start to kind of think about the look and the feel, but also how they'll apply it to different rooms in the.
Yeah, it's interesting on Pinterest when you type in biophilic design in the home, it's still like very epic. It's very full trees in your living room. It's so cool. And I would assume this would be a fabulous course for interior designers to take too, right? Because
Yeah.
we want more interior designers preaching
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I mean, we,
biophilia.
we wrote it for people who are interested in design, who want to learn about the basics of biophilic design and then how to apply it. So, having some design interest and some skills will definitely allow you to accelerate much faster.
Mhm.
Essentially, it will become a catalyst in your biophilic design journey.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a delight talking to you. We will link all of the projects that we discussed and more and your website because your website is such an interesting place to just click around and see the potential, see what's possible. What are your favorite biophilic design elements in your home? Just to round this out, personally as the expert, what have you valued the most?
The things that have made the most difference, I live in a 1960s home. It's a
Hmm.
brick building. It had quite small windows, lots of sort of plastic UPVC window frames. So we took the windows out, we extended them down to the ground, we widened them. All the living spaces look out onto our garden. We've sort of got a flush threshold from the inside to the outside. I think really the key one is the use and access to natural light and how we control
Yeah.
it. It's the views out onto nature, looking out onto the greenery, seeing the different sort of color temperatures of light. The front of my house has this enormous wisteria plant that I've been growing for about 10
Mm.
years.
Wow.
And in the next few days, it's going to burst into life. So I'm gonna put a picture onto my Instagram page. So if anybody wants to sort of follow us on Oliver Heath Design, you'll see a picture of my wisteria. About this time of the year, it kind of just bursts into life, and it literally looks like fireworks of flowers just kind of exploding across the building.
Incredible.
It's really exciting, actually. Yeah, just to see
Talk
this.
about awe,
I know it
right?
really is, and literally people stop in the street and look out like, "Wow, that's amazing!" Because literally the entire front of the building is this sort of cascade of purple, white, and yellow flowers. It's
Mm.
amazing. So that gives me quite a lot of pleasure. It's really, really such a wonderful way to come home.
Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
beautiful. So one more time, where can everyone find you?
Well, our website is oliverheathdesign.com. You can find us there, or join me on LinkedIn. I am Oliver Heath, and you'll see my face on that. Or on our Instagram page, Oliver Heath Design. Did I say that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Or
great.
yeah,
And
or kind of
we'll
look up
link to
our book.
everything.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely link to your book in the show
Great.
notes as
Great.
well. Well, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for staying up
Well, it's not so late. It's still just about light outside.
working later, to be with us. And yeah, appreciate you so much, and so looking forward to see how you continue to be the thought leader this. I hope takes over the whole world.
Yeah, yeah,
Wouldn't it be
that's what it needs to
cool?
happen, isn't it? Every space should be a healthy space, shouldn't it?
Do you think it's possible? Do you think
I
in our
think it could
lifetime
be.
it's
Why not?
possible?
Yeah, yeah. Why not? I
Yeah.
mean, I guess, what's important is that we're not just designing to support human life. We should be designing to support all life. So
Yes.
the realms of biophilic design really should go more than just being human-centered. It should be life-centered.
Yes. Earth centered. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Oliver.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.